last few folks in. Want to welcome everyone for joining us today. We are excited to share with you our webinar, Blackout Communities Without Vital Data. It's co-hosted by MAX, Minnesotans for the American Community Survey, and the Census Project. I'm Joan Neymark, co-director of MAX. Our topic is crucial for communities to make informed decisions and thrive. The House Commerce, Justice, Science Committee recently approved Section 605 in the Census Appropriations Bill. It's a short, seemingly minor section, but if enacted, it would be widely felt. There are two troublesome parts which would reduce response rates. First, all federal surveys would be voluntary instead of mandatory as they are today, and households can get up to 2 response requests. That's it. But it's not just Section 605 of the appropriation bill. Bills introduced in the House and Senate this year would make the ACS a voluntary survey. Voluntary surveys have lower self-response rates, and those who respond are different from those who don't respond. Voluntary surveys bring out these differences. Any action that depresses response or decreases trust is harmful. Remember, non-response is a nonpartisan issue important to all states. Federal data are a public good. What if the data weren't accurate or reliable? Could we manage without it? Administrative and private sector data supplement federal statistics, but do not replace them. A business leader recently reminded me that the 21st century runs on data. It's how the U.S. maintains our leadership and competitive edge with federal statistics at the base. I know this from my own career in the private sector using census and ACS data every day for decades. Today's subject matter experts will present an analysis of how these restrictions may affect both availability and data quality. Data blackout maps illustrate the impact. Data might go unpublished or be unreliable with large margins of error, especially harmful in rural areas that rely on surveys like the ACS. We start with Canada's test of a voluntary survey. It's not a pretty story. Next, we explore the collaboration between Congress and the Census Bureau to test a voluntary ACS and recent research by the Census Quality Reinforcement Task Force about limiting the number of non-response follow-up contacts. We'll then share actions that you can take. Start with some housekeeping and an acknowledgement. A new report, also called Blackout and focused on the Black community, is now available. This webinar today addresses the data blackout that could happen nationwide if Section 605 remains in the appropriations bill. Housekeeping. Only speakers will be visible on the screen. Participants cannot use the chat, but we will share updates there. Please submit your questions to the Q&A section at any time. After we hear from the speakers, we'll proceed to a brief Q&A. All questions will be answered live or included in the post-webinar materials, which will include the recording, slides, and fact sheets. Each question will be anonymous. Now we're going to turn it over to Steve Jost of the Census Project. Steve?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And I think we've got an excellent panel of experts to talk to you about some of the challenges facing surveys in general, but also specifically the ACS and the decennial census. I had the honor to serve as the Associate Director at the Census Bureau for both the 2000 and the 2010 decennial counts, overseeing the massive multi-million-dollar outreach and advertising campaigns to get cooperation. And in preparing for this session, I was thinking about how a lot of the topics we're talking about today were not prevalent in the American decennial census for more than a century. We had mandatory response because in 1790, Thomas Jefferson sent out the U.S. Marshals to knock on your door and get your cooperation. And all the way up through 1960, we had those famous enumerators at your door filling out those big registers. And talk about self-identity. They looked at you and decided what your race was in many cases. Today, we face a whole different set of challenges, in part because the 1990 census was labeled a failure. It was the first census that significantly saw a decline in quality and response rate. We had a response rate because the Bureau introduced the innovation of the mail-out, mail-back census in 1970. And in 1970, it worked very well, and again in 1980. But in 1990, the response rates dropped. And Congress gave the Census Bureau this big advertising budget, which the Bureau didn't think would work. When I arrived, I remember them lecturing me. And what we have since is a very familiar pattern for both the 2000, the 2010, and the 2010 decennials. 67% of the public self-response by mail, by phone, by internet, despite all the innovations and survey designs and cognitive research, we've had the same pattern. And then a vast army of enumerators have to go door to door to get cooperation from the other 1/3. So that's kind of a pinpoint on the issue of mandatory and why it's so important, and quality, and getting a full and complete and equitable count. So my job here is to introduce you to the folks that are going to tell you about the Canadian experience, and then what the American Census Bureau did to study the Canadian experience and inform Congress what a voluntary ACS might mean for the country in terms of data. And we're gonna start off with Rosemary Bender, who is, since 2010, was the assistant chief statistician at Stats Canada, and lived through that experience in Canada with their census. And Kelly Ash, who's a senior researcher at the Center for Rural Policy and Development. And I'm going to hand it off to Kelly to start the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And thanks everybody for joining us today. Really appreciate the time to kind of dig into something that maybe a lot of people don't pay attention to, might be a little bit more technical. But for people like me, this is a really, really important topic. Again, I work for the Center for Rural Policy and Development. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based in rural Minnesota that conducts research for rural Minnesota. One thing I think that's really interesting to note is that we were actually created by the Minnesota State Legislature. And the whole idea for creating us was legislators felt like when they were talking about policy, metro-based organizations would show up and they had the resources and the technical know-how to bring data and really talk about how policies were going to impact their populations or their regions or their economies. And they felt like it was more anecdotal from rural areas. They knew the data existed, but they wanted an organization that could kind of corral that data and speak to it through a rural lens. And that's been our job. And we've used data.
Looks like Kelly might have frozen. I think we'll just go right to Rosemary's presentation while Kelly diagnoses his issues.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me here today. Today I will speak to the Canadian experience with changes to the census, and in particular, our census long form, which is equivalent to the American Community Survey. And the strength of both of these surveys is in the detailed demographic and socioeconomic data they provide for communities, large and small. It happened to us twice. In 1986, the census was canceled outright. The reason? Cost savings of about $100 million. In 2011, the situation was very different. The government mandated Statistics Canada to change from a mandatory to a voluntary survey. They said they had received complaints from citizens about intrusion of privacy. Yet, our federal privacy commissioner testified before our parliamentary committee to say that there have been relatively few complaints over the past 20 years. This confirmed our own sense of the trust Canadians had for the census. But we were still very concerned at Statistics Canada because we knew what a voluntary survey would mean to data quality. This is because response rates are much lower for voluntary surveys. Non-respondents generally have characteristics that differ from those of respondents, creating biases in the data, affecting data accuracy and how useful they can be. Our chief statistician resigned in 2010, a month after the decision, and just as I was coming on board as assistant chief statistician. He didn't resign over the decision itself, as the government had the authority to do it. It was more the implication that Statistics Canada supported the notion that the new survey could become a substitute for a mandatory census. And as he said, it cannot. As expected, the NHS response rates dropped significantly, creating headlines across the country. Generally in the mid to high 90 percentiles, the NHS rates were only 69%. That means over 30% of Canadians we didn't reach. Now, if these were random non-respondents, we could have adjusted for this. But non-respondents tend to be the very groups that are needed of targeted social and economic programs, rural, lower income, youth, immigrants. To plan and administer these programs, long-form information is used extensively by governments, organizations, businesses, and this is why we conduct a long-form census and why we need to include everyone. In the end, the 2011 NHS results were too problematic for 25% of Canada's primarily small and rural communities. And for those we did publish, many still had data quality issues. This was huge, and what some considered awful, a disaster. This population density map of Canada shows in orange how rural and small town Canada occupies large swaths of land across our southern border, where much of the suppression occurred. For provinces, sometimes compared to American states, it is clear that we published less for the more rural ones. For Canada as a whole, we were able to publish data for about 3,400 municipalities or census subdivision, about 75% of them. For those provinces in red, with percentages below 75%, these are found in Atlantic Canada and in the Prairie provinces, and in particular for Saskatchewan, we were only able to publish 57% of the data. Now a bit about the pushback by Canadians to these decisions and the impact they had. For both 1986 and 2011, the outcry came from a wide gamut of public and private sectors. Many are listed here. Their message was common. Long-form data are vital for planning for social and economic development in areas such as health, education, labor, poverty, immigration. The circumstances, though, around the 1986 and 2011 decisions were quite different, and they played out differently as well. In 1986, with the outright cancellation of the census, the outcry from Canadians was immediate and strong. I mean, the idea that you could cancel a census came as a shock. People relate to the census, and they were not happy that it was being taken away. It was in the news. It was grassroots. It was talked about in the schools, in the coffee shops. The media covered it extensively, in particular the Globe and Mail, with articles on how these data are needed, for example, in the retail trade or the housing construction industries. There was strong public backlash from big businesses, from retailers. And at Statistics Canada, our networks were buzzing. We heard from a number of national organizations, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Canadian Federation of Agriculture, the Canadian Federation of Municipalities, the Canadian Association for Business Economics, Canadian Marketing Association. We were quite busy then, and there was strong pushback from federal government departments who pointed to constitutional and legislative requirements for the data, and this was key. The data were needed as input for transfer payments or used for a lot of the government social programs. So given the strong pushback from all sides, the decision to cancel the census was reversed within a month, providing federal departments assume the cost. For 2011, the situation was quite different. The long form was not canceled, but the method of collection became voluntary. This was a more subtle change, as data would still be produced. The statistical arguments around bias and data quality, they were too technical for many to understand. The public reaction from big business and retailers and from the rural community was more muted than in 1986. The pushback was more behind the scenes, from hundreds of municipal, business, and trade associations, letters, parliamentary committee appearances, community newspapers. From the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, we heard the local detail that flows from the long questionnaire is essential for companies designing sales campaigns or trying to decide where to expand or to locate. Despite this opposition, the 2011 voluntary NHS went ahead at a higher cost of $27 million. Most of this extra cost was spent on a larger sample to salvage data at the provincial level. It was not meant to help rural and small communities, and it didn't. There continued to be pushback once the 2011 results were published. Reports cautioned on their use. They said some of the data was not comparable to previous censuses or to surveys, and it made historical trend analysis almost impossible. The head of Environics Analytics was asked in an interview in 2015 about how her company was faring with the NHS data. Her company is a Canadian business leader in data analytics and the marketing information industry, and for 40 years had been integrating census data with local, public, and private sector data to create neighborhood and regional profiles for businesses and local organizations. Her technical staff had to devote much time and labor to estimate for the missing or poor 2011 data. She said the estimates were useful, but not the same quality as the census, and it would only get more difficult in the future as you move further away from the 2006 benchmark. Other voices. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities and the Canadian Council of Social Development expressed their concerns about the spotty data. On seniors living in their home, Vancouver pointed out that there was a significant deviation between the NHS numbers and the 2001 and 2006 trends. The Peterborough Medical Officer of Health said they were not able to develop a clear picture of their population's health. It was clear that the data for quality data for communities would never be there with a voluntary census, even spending more money. In 2015, data users across the country were thrilled when the decision was reversed as a new government reinstated the mandatory long form. Even more, 2 years later, the government introduced legislation to make this permanent. The 2017 legislation changes went even further, strengthening the independence of the chief statistician with regard to methodology and collection methods. The government has the authority to mandate Statistics Canada to collect statistical information. They just cannot dictate how this should be done. So in Canada, we tried a voluntary national household survey, and it didn't work. Simply put, it cannot produce quality and useful data that are vital for rural and small area social and economic development. Again, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Rosemary. And I apologize, my power blinked off there for a second, so I had to wait for everything to kind of roll back on here. One of the perks of living in rural areas, I'm in rural Minnesota, so That's the way it goes. I have a couple questions, Rosemary. And, as I was doing this research, because obviously as a research organization, we have to look at proposed legislation and then kind of think about nonpartisanly what kind of impacts this will have. I was so excited that Canada had already tried something similar to this. It's not every day that researchers get, essentially an example of a policy that's so close that have implemented something so similar that we can kind of utilize. If you were to ground this, I am in rural Minnesota. Through your experience, what could I expect in rural Minnesota? What percentage of, let's say, Minnesota might we think there might be no data for? Is that something you can kind of give us?
Well, that's a difficult question. But what I can tell you, though, is that you would lose a large percentage of data with a voluntary survey. I think that is clear from the Canadian experience. Not that we were excited to have this experience, but having gone through it, we can certainly say that if you require small area data for rural areas or small town areas, the only viable source is a mandatory survey. A voluntary survey in the prairies in Canada, if you just want to sort of benchmark, it was certainly much higher than 25%, and in Saskatchewan went as high as 57%. These are large numbers. And Statistics Canada, they suggested perhaps you can use data at higher geographic levels, but no, for much of the work that you're doing and that others are doing in the rural areas, the characteristics of your areas are different from those of the larger regional and provincial or state areas. So you can't rely on the higher level geographies to give you the data you need. Administrative data, also an option, but administrative data can never replace mandatory census data. They're not grounded. They don't have the basic solid foundational infrastructure that a mandatory survey would give you.
I can't agree with you more in terms of how higher level statistics and data really truly may not represent particularly rural geographic areas. It's something we write about all the time. Most of our research is dedicated to that difference across the state between urban and rural, and even between rural areas themselves. One thing I wanted to ask is, I find it fascinating that when they got rid of it, there was quite an uproar. But when they were just talking about this switch from mandatory to voluntary, it was a little more subtle. It didn't get the kind of eyes on it, maybe didn't get a wide-reaching conversation nationally about it, because it was a little hard for people to kind of grab onto and wrap their arms around. But there was quite an uproar once the data came back. I'm curious to know, was it a kind of combination of, people on the ground being like, oh yeah, this is bad? Or was it kind of like looking at all the data and being like, oh my gosh, there's so much data that's missing? What really kind of grabbed people to be like, yeah, this was maybe not a great idea to move forward with?
Yeah, the reaction from the rural and a lot of Canadians was much more muted in 2011, and I think it was because it's a much more technical conversation. When it was made voluntary, the idea and the notion was that data would still be produced. So the Canadians not all Canadians really understood the technicalities of talking about bias and non-response bias and how this would impact the ability to release some of the data. It's a difficult conversation to have, and as long as you thought you were getting some data, then there was not much outcry. However, within a lot of those communities, those that belonged to data organizations or that were more savvy data users, they did do pushback even before and after. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't a public outcry. It was more behind the scenes, writing letters and talking to their MPs. So that's how that played out. And it was only once the data were released or not released in large numbers that suddenly the outcry became a little bit stronger, and the media took it up a little bit more, such that within a couple of years of those data being released or not released, the legislation was changed so that this wouldn't happen again.
So that's what we're doing here. Yeah. As a major user, big time data user, here I am. I'm being like, I don't think this is the way we should go. This might be a bad idea. hopefully it kind of builds from there, and we can kind of get some momentum on this to kind of teach people like, yeah, this has been tried, and it's a touchy situation. Rosemary, thanks so much for your insights. I know there's probably gonna be some Q&A with you, so appreciate you staying on and answering more questions. And Steve, I'll pass it back to you.
Well, thank you. Before I introduce the next panel, I have a quick question for Rosemary. It seems you had two really bad outcomes here. In the first instance, you had no data. And in the second instance, you had, and I'll use a statistical term, muddy results. You didn't know where the problems were because it was a poor performance. You just didn't have the coverage, you didn't have the accuracy that you wanted. Would you agree that that made it more difficult to use the 2011 results?
Yeah, well, some people are saying, and some of us included, that sometimes it can be worse to have poor data than no data at all.
Yeah.
Because if you have no data at all, then you're really pushed to try and find or bring back mechanisms and surveys, mandatory surveys. When it's iffy data or data that's either suppressed or poor quality, many users didn't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
It wasn't as useful to them as they would have liked, and to their surprise.
Well, an important lesson, and now we'll pivot to our US panel to talk about what this means for the American Community Survey. Our expert is Krista Jones, former chief of staff at the US Census Bureau, who served there since 2002 and under 3 different directors and a countless number of acting directors across the policy office, congressional and intergovernmental affairs, the decennial. So she has a really rich and deep perspective in how the decennial operation works. And with her is Beth DeRose, who's got a 25-year career in this world and is currently the senior fellow for the Massive Data Institute at Georgetown University, which I don't know if that's a description of the data or the building that you're working in. And she's also vice president of the Association of Public Data Users. And I'll turn it over to you too.
Thank you, Stephen. And if you've seen the building, it's probably both. So I'm going to rewind the clock for about 25 years and say that, are you getting an echo or is it just me?
I don't hear an echo.
Okay, good. So I'm going to rewind the clock by about 25 years and remind people that 2000 was the last time we had a census long form. Around that time, we had started talking about maybe moving to an annual survey that we all now know as the American Community Survey. Can't imagine it ever didn't exist. But in 2003, we were questioning what it would take to complete the ACS successfully if it were voluntary instead of mandatory. So Krista, that's happening. We're trying to figure out how to move from this every 10 years to every year and thinking about the structure of that. Can you tell us a little bit about the research from that time?
Sure. When we did our first initial research in a voluntary ACS, the context was that the ACS was being presented as the replacement to the decennial long form. And that's a really important point about this because we were coming out of the 2000 census. We had done a lot of research during the 2000 census, and we had results comparing the ACS and the decennial census long form. And it was very compelling. And the researchers, the Census Bureau, we had been talking with Congress, and Congress was very supportive at this time because what the ACS was going to give communities, especially if you are a small rural community, it was going to give you something that had never been available before, and that was going to be annual data. Rather than having the census long form. Because if you remember back in the old days, in the dark ages, at the end of the decennial life cycle, you had data that were as old as 13 years old from the time of when they had been collected to when the decennial long form data were released with the next cycle. So when we were presenting the ACS, this was about providing something that was never available before for small communities neighborhoods, tracts, small population groups, and that was going to be reliable annual data. And this was a really important feature of the ACS. But Congress, the one thing that Congress was asking the Census Bureau was, can you do this for the as a voluntary survey? And that's what the 2003 test was about. So they allowed us to have the resources to do this test. It was a very robust test that the Census Bureau conducted in 2003. And we were not surprised because, as Rosemary said in the earlier panel, we do know that voluntary surveys do not achieve the same results. So they allowed us to have a larger sample because they understood this. And we went out and we completed the interviews for this, and was not, as you look at these results, it's not surprising. It took more interviews. It cost more. I think the big takeaway was just how much more it was going to cost to conduct a voluntary ACS. And I think Congress then pulled back and said, okay, it's not worth $60 million more a year to have it be voluntary. We want the ACS, but we'll let you continue to conduct it under the mandatory authority. But there were also some other results embedded in there that were even more troubling and more concerning. It wasn't just the cost when we began to dig into the results. And so if we move on a little bit, I'd like to tell you a bit more about the results when we dug in a bit more into these results. And Rosemary also hit a little bit on this as well. It's really great because the US and Canada share our research with one another, and we learn a lot from one another. But when we dug into the results, there is a differential in who responds and who doesn't respond. But what happened in the United States is we lost ground with what we refer to as the high responding households. So the high responding households were the white non-Hispanic household. And this was really surprising, just how much ground we lost. So this was going to make the survey when I mentioned how much more the survey would have cost, this is part of what the cost driver was for this, making the survey more expensive, was the need to follow up in more of those households. So the households that were the households that you would typically think of high responding households. And we knew these were high responding households because of the 2000 census and other surveys. They began to not respond to the ACS voluntary survey. And that meant that we had to conduct the more expensive in-person visits. And at the same time, because we had to conduct in-person visits to those households, we wouldn't be conducting in-person visits to the low responding households, and we would be losing sample with those households. And those were the lower responding areas. And those would be typically your non-white and Hispanic households. And therefore, the ACS results we knew would be less reliable at that point. So at the end of the day, we knew that a voluntary ACS was going to become less reliable, more burdensome, because we would be having to conduct more interviews in the end as well, and more expensive. And so this was part of what the results that we showed Congress that really convinced Congress to let the Census Bureau continue to use the mandatory authority at that time.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what the maps show in terms of the, thinking about, that was where they came out with in 2003, the survey, very clear, it was going to cost more, quality wasn't going to be as good. So then in 2011, weirdly, this topic came back, felt like it was pretty well resolved, but, not quite a decade later came back again, and you did additional research, and that gets us into the maps that we see on the screen here.
Yeah, I see Steve grinning at this. This is sort of Groundhog Day with the Census Bureau, ACS voluntary. Yeah, we had this topic come up again, and the Census Bureau at this point, this came back really as really an issue about privacy and intrusion, and members of Congress coming to the Census Bureau with concerns from their constituents about the intrusiveness of the survey. As well, these were also really lean budget years. So when we went back to look at the ACS, we did not have funding to conduct another test at this time. So we had to go back and revisit the results of the 2003 test. So the Census Bureau simulated the results, and what we found, because one of the key things that we didn't do in 2003 was we didn't carry forward and look at the data. We didn't provide, we didn't look at what the actual the quality of the data, what would have been under the 2003 data. So in 2011, we processed the data and a simulated ACS voluntary, and took the data from that, and we had to do it under the constraint of a fixed budget, because we knew that the Census Bureau at that stage, that Congress was not going to permit a sample expansion that would have been on the table in 2003. So these maps, when you look at these, and it's kind of hard to see. So it's not so much trying to look at and define, what counties you're looking at here. This is really just to see the comparison of color with these maps, and to get a sense of what's happening. So what the maps are moving from is, if you are looking at the lighter colors, this means that most of the tracts in the county have acceptable data quality. And if the maps are darker in color, then that means most of the tracts in the county do not have acceptable data quality. So what happens when you move to the ACS voluntary is you see that almost all of the counties in the United States no longer have acceptable data quality. And for most of the states, most of their counties no longer have acceptable data quality. And this really puts into question whether or not the ACS is even viable at that point, and whether or not you would even have an ACS. And I wanted to show this sort of at a more granular level. Alabama is the first state. So I apologize if you're from Alabama. It's always the first state and the easiest example to use. But Alabama, this is what happened. This is sort of a way to easily show this. Because if you look at Alabama, most of the states under mandatory are in the light colors. There's just a few counties that have this darker shading under the ACS mandatory. But if you moved under that ACS voluntary, all but one county is now in these darker, and two counties. So you've basically moved into almost every county in Alabama is no longer going to have available data at that point. So that's just a good example to show to share.
And then moving on to one more type of analysis, everything we've talked about to date is just that, and I say just, voluntary versus mandatory, obviously very, very important, dramatic implications for the quality of the data or availability of the data, but none of the past proposals also suggested limiting the number of contact attempts. And, I know it was 45 minutes ago, but Joan mentioned at the top that also is part of the proposed budget language this year, to reduce the number of contact attempts to a maximum of 2. And we're looking at both voluntary and maximum 2 contact attempts at the same time. So can you tell us a bit about what limiting contact strategies might change as well?
So I think this would have a devastating draconian effect on the ACS, and practically any survey, but especially something like the ACS. I don't think it would be viable. The Census Quality Research, they put out this very helpful map. This map looks at the decennial census, the most recent decennial census in 2020, and this is a best case scenario. The decennial census is the largest data collection. It has full air support of the media campaign, the partnership and outreach. It has advocates, community partners, people advocating for it. This is the best case scenario response effort. And if you look at what happened under this scenario and what they've modeled here, you look at most of the country. The best case scenario, once again, is in this lighter shade. That is just a handful of states. We're at 30% at 2 contacts. Most of the country are in these darker shades. So if you were thinking of this, and this is a mandatory with full air support from all of this partnership and media, I cannot imagine what an ACS map would in reality look like. I think we have another map that might kind of give us a sense of what we would expect. But once again, this is also modeled on the ACS voluntary map. And I think that, it's just, it's really tough to imagine what an ACS that is both voluntary and can only make 2 contacts, that there would be any practical data with that type of survey. I mean, it's almost sort of shifting to a poll instead of a practical survey.
Yeah, really, really clear on that last map that bad data is a problem for all sorts of communities across the country. So when we were prepping for this, you talked about a couple of specific examples where, the real world implications of having bad data. And I would love for you to share that with the audience now.
Yeah, there were a couple of things during my time at Census that really stood out for me. And those were times when we worked very closely with communities and in response to natural disasters and emergencies, and we were working to help these communities, and sometimes very closely with local governments. The first example is after the Baltimore bridge collapse, the Key Bridge. The folks with the community resilience estimates worked with the Maryland Emergency Management and did an analysis very quickly using the community resilience estimates and some commercial mapping data to look at the effect of the commute of what would happen with the commuters and how their commutes would change and who would be affected by this. And that told a story for Maryland about the recovery and how they could best address the recovery needs from the Key Bridge collapse. And that's a great example because the community resilience estimates are built off of the ACS microdata. The Census Bureau is using those estimates, and that we use them in combination with other data, and we work with state and local governments, with other federal agencies to use those data to the best of the situation to really suss out insights about the socially vulnerable and to get insights about what is happening. And the second example, once again, focuses on what happened after Hurricane Helene. And there's been quite a bit of analysis done at the Census Bureau about who was affected after Hurricane Helene, what those who had access to power, who applied for individual assistance payments, and that has a lot of insight for the long-term viability of those communities who were in the path of Hurricane Helene, particularly in Western North Carolina, and what will happen to those communities. And that speaks to the power of something like the ACS. The ACS is not something that it can be replaced by what any single community or state can do. It's a national resource, because if you want to do something like to track the path of a hurricane, it doesn't stop at the boundary of a county or the boundary of a state. You need something like the ACS that the Census Bureau, a federal agency, is collecting, that has consistency across every community, and that has standardized margins of error, high quality, that is available consistently, and that will be available over time every year, that is going to be it's going to be there for communities. And I can't imagine what would happen if we didn't have it for these communities.
I don't want to think too hard about what happens if we don't have it, because so critical.
Yeah.
So if we had voluntary and limited contacts, that means most communities are going to lack this really crucial source of data for their communities. And it's going to cost more to have poorer quality data. And given Section 605, this is a real possibility. So Steve, with that very uplifting comment, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yeah, and I was sitting here thinking, Krista and I lived through the era of the census controversy around undercounts and differential undercounts and underserved communities, all the consequence of the 1990 failure. And both of these proposals would make that worse on top of what Beth just summarized. It's going to cost more, you're going to have worse data, and those communities are going to be left out even more than they are now.
Definitely.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to pitch it over to our sports booth with my colleague Howard Feinberg from the Census Project to run us through the Q&A session and get us to the end of this presentation.
Thanks, Steve. Howard Feinberg with the Census Project here. So we have a ton of questions, most of them submitted beforehand and a bunch now. So I'm going to start with one that was pitched early on in this, asking which House member proposed and championed these caps on follow-up or contact or query, depending on which version in the House CJS appropriations bill, and what's their argument. Quick answer is we don't really know. It is someone in the House Republican caucus, several of them, and it's not been disclosed. They've not been public about it, so it's kind of hard to say. We've been doing our best to counter it, given the vagueness of the language and the lack of background. In terms of making the ACS voluntary, that's been going on now since 2012, 2011, when the House first voted to make the ACS voluntary, and then of course voted to eliminate it entirely. All the biggest proponents of that are all at this point long gone from Congress. Although one of them, John Culberson, I think is a great example to make, congressman from Texas, who was a big proponent of making the ACS voluntary until we had a good sit down with him, and he learned more about it and learned of its constitutional origins in the long form and what the founders actually felt about asking more than just how many people were in a household, and that completely turned him around on the subject. So there's always great prospects for making improvements here and making progress with folks. There is, of course, still legislation in current day trying to make ACS voluntary, the Freedom from Government Surveys Act. That's Senator Risch and Congressman Stubbe, both of companion bills that would make the ACS voluntary, and there's always others percolating and popping up. But it's thankfully mostly a minority demand at this point, but a problematic one, certainly. We also, let's see, ones that everybody else can answer instead of me. We had a question about the proportional effect on race and income categories from a voluntary ACS, and I guess, correspondingly voluntary survey in Canada. Do you have anything that you can point to demographic wise?
Maybe that would go to Krista. Krista, I imagine those race and income categories that are the smallest are going to suffer the most distortion. Is that right?
We lost ground across all race categories, and I did put in response to Karen, I did put the link to the 2003 report. I don't know if it popped up yet.
Okay. Any other responses? Okay. Next question is if Canada has ever enforced a mandatory requirement and charged someone for not answering. Because, of course, in the US, it's been many, many decades since that happened, and it was sort of a formulaic thing that it's not something the Bureau actually goes and does.
No, in Canada, that is really not the approach that we like to take. Even though, according to law, there are consequences. The ability to go back and to do follow-up and to discuss with the with the respondents is usually far more acceptable and provides much better results. A few have persisted in really not wanting to answer the mandatory form. These have faced some consequences, but certainly never any jail time.
Yeah.
All right, fair enough. We're united, I think, in that. Another question here, it's a more broad question about the ACS because of the government shutdown. We've lost a month at least of collecting ACS data. What do you all expect that to mean for the upcoming 1-year estimates and rolling 5-year estimates from the ACS?
So the ACS has lost sample before. Obviously, there have been other shutdowns, and the Census Bureau has been able to recover from those. But there have also, obviously, in 2020, due to COVID, there were substantial losses in that, and there were data quality issues and data availability delays. So I think the Census Bureau. That's probably a question best referred to them as the shutdown either persists or doesn't persist. That they will be looking very closely at that.
Excellent. No, okay. So I think I've got a broad question on the rural uses of ACS data, how rural and small communities make use of ACS data, and are there other data sources that are, on comparably useful or that fall into the same category as the ACS for rural information?
Well, I can help answer that just because I use it all the time for rural areas. I'll give an example of how we use it. This is back in 2015 in rural Minnesota, we were starting to see some shortages in childcare. And my colleague, Marnie Werner, she was doing this research and was kind of the first one to start raising a red flag like, hey, there's some childcare shortages and they're going to get worse. And one of the data points she uses in the ACS, and now we see it used all the time in the state, where they look at the number of licensed slots or spots in childcare, which we can get through administrative records. But what we can't get is how many households or parents are both working with children under 5. You can't get that level of data, particularly at the county, without the ACS. And that really then being able to show the gap of here's how many slots are in a county. This is how many we're projecting for a childcare need is. That chart showing the gap That's what changes policy. That's what drives conversations. And without that data, again, we're going back to anecdotes, which our state legislature here in Minnesota said, we don't want that anymore. We need data. I can't just rely on anecdotes. So that's just one example of 100 that I could tell.
There. Thank you, Kelly. Let's see what else we have here. So someone's pointing out a lot of the concerns about making the ACS voluntary come back to worries about government overreach, intrusion into people's privacy, and certainly there are concerns about being forced to respond to questions. Is that something that has changed over time? Has that been an eternal issue, or is that a modern issue? Is it going away?
I'll take that one. I mean, this has only been since 2011, as someone pointed out. The Tea Party seized on it for a time. Other folks have ridden this wave. I think when you educate them that the history of the long form in the United States is it was much longer than the current ACS, when Madison got his hands on it and started adding all kinds of stuff. Well, I'm exaggerating, of course, but the constitutional origins, as Mr. or Representative Culberson found out, typically totally flips people on this. When they find out that this was Madison and Jefferson and the founders feeling this was essential to preserving and extending the democracy, they get with the program. The resistance fades away. I think there is we live in a time of privacy, and maybe Beth's got something to say about that, where this is exaggerated a bit more. but generally in all our work trying to help people understand why the ACS is essential, that origin stuff has really flipped their point of view.
Had one more question. Last question before we have to switch to one last topic. To what extent do you think administrative data, as well as data in things like the demographic frame at the Bureau, would compensate for fewer contacts and queries?
I think that's
yeah. Oh, go ahead,
if I can, just a quick piece, and then Krista, maybe you can jump in. So I think that's a great question. I think there's a lot of power in the administrative data resources. For example, what's the age of the house? What's the size of the lot? How many units are in the structure? A lot of that could be gotten from administrative sources. And in all of the places where we could replace the data, maybe that reduces the amount of time people need to spend taking the survey, increases their likelihood of doing it. The challenge with that is that in many places where we want the data, the administrative data, rural areas, for example, might be less likely to have digital tax records for their properties. So that data is still going to be missing. There's this balancing act of making sure that you've got consistent information for everybody, and that if you don't, then you're filling it in with other sources. So I think it's a both and. I think there's lots of ways administrative data could help, but I don't think they're going to be the complete solution.
Yeah, I would totally put stuff on what Beth is saying. It is a both and now that I'm no longer at the Census Bureau, I would say that this is a great. I would put in a plug for this is an area where a lot more could be done. That there are a lot of data out there, and there are a lot of things that the Census Bureau could do. This could be a real win to reduce the burden on certain households. The Census Bureau could reduce the burden. The Census Bureau could also be using these data to, as I mentioned earlier with the CRE, there are ways that the Census Bureau could be using these data to extend the utility of the ACS. And to make the ACS more responsive to community needs by working with local governments and state governments and their data to answer specific needs for those states and communities. So I think it's a both and I think there's a lot of potential here.
Excellent. So lastly, we got several questions about how people and organizations can take action on both Section 605 and the House CJS Appropriations Bill, and in support of the ACS overall. So obviously, and this was asked also, sharing the webinar and all the follow-up materials we're going to send. There are going to be lots of links. I highly recommend sharing those with interested parties. That's going to be an important way to share the information around and open people's eyes and ears. Certainly contacting your elected representatives and senators if you so choose. There are some examples on how you could go about that. There was a letter that we led at the Insights Association from the business community, emphasizing the business side. Census Project, one of our sign-on letters and several of our communications have highlighted some of the concerns, and we have a one-pager on Section 605 as well. Supporting funding requests to the Census Bureau. We do sign-on letters regularly. I highly recommend getting your organizations on those. We take local, state, and national. And signing up for updates from the Census Project. And if you're from Minnesota, I highly recommend talking to Joan Neymark, making sure that you're signed up for updates from Minnesotans for the ACS. And with that, we're pretty much out of time. Any final word from everybody on the panel, or?
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah,
Thanks for joining.
Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you, Howard, for guiding us through those questions. And thank you all for attending, and spread the word on what you learned from this event today.
Yeah, thank you guys very much. And thank you to everybody for participating.
And we will work through the questions that were asked in the Q&A and get responses out along with the rest of the materials in the next day or so. Thanks, everyone. Good job.